and welcome to another episode of Strange Encounters Down Under. And tonight, Ben and I are talking about time slips, which are spontaneous experiences where people step from their time into another time, sometimes into the past and sometimes into the future. So have you got some stories to tell, Ben, about time slips? I mean, have you ever had an experience yourself?
I've not had an experience myself, but it's something that I would love to experience. Like, I think it would be a fascinating, if you're going to enter into the world of the paranormal, it's probably maybe a good way to have that experience would be to have a time slip, particularly maybe a shorter one, something that wasn't too long or too arduous. And there's many instances where time slips are actually quite short and brief.
Yeah.
So personally, I've not had that experience. I'll put myself in lots of locations where it might have happened, anywhere where there's, yeah, exactly right. Fingers crossed. Anywhere where there's, old buildings or anything like that, you sort of, maybe think that might happen. And there tends to be a lot of them in Europe and in England and America, like they've older histories. I'm not sure about the history of time slips in Australia. So I don't know of too many Australian cases. So maybe there's work to be done in that area. I'm not sure. But I thought I'd kick off tonight with talking about some of the very famous time slip events that have occurred, and I've actually looked into it over the years with quite a bit of interest, because I do think it's a very fascinating phenomenon that you can sort of maybe loop through time in some way, and how that happens is really anyone's guess. So you've got to be right spot, right time, same as any other experience, really. Or maybe it's receptibility. Who knows what these things are? But the one I want to talk about first of all occurred to a famous airman from England. His name was Air Marshal Sir Robert Victor Goddard, and he was very high-ranking, and that sort of really helps to sort of solidify perhaps the reality of his experience as well, being that he was just not a man off the street. He was very, very high ranking. And in 1935, he was flying over a disused air base in the village of Drem near Edinburgh, when he claimed to have seen the airfield change before his eyes. And he'd flown out that day. And when he first passed over it, it was just the derelict place. So there was all holes in the runway. There was weeds growing up through it. There was cows and dilapidated buildings. So he'd been sent on this reconnaissance mission to go out and have a look at it. And then he flew off to do some other things. And as he flew away and went out, the weather changed and the weather became really bad. And he was starting to get a little bit concerned about being disorientated. Remember, this is in 1935. So he turns around and heads back towards the Drem airfield, flying through just terrible rain. The rain's just really coming down badly. And as he approaches Drem, all of a sudden, the rain clouds just part and it's blue sky, complete blue sky. And he's flying just in brilliant sunshine. And he looks down, tilts the plane and looks down, has a look, and he can see that the airfield is actually full of life. So he sees that the airstrip is not full of weeds and cracks and cows. He sees that the airstrip is actually a fully functioning airstrip. He sees mechanics in blue uniforms standing around the buildings. And he sees 4 yellow planes on the tarmac. And he thought that was really strange. And he flew back and basically got on with his life. But in 1939, fast forward 4 years, the Drem airfield had been completely renovated. And in 1935, all the training planes were silver. And in 1939, the training planes became yellow. And at that time too, they also changed the overalls of the mechanics to a blue uniform. So, and this is again, is what you'd call a fairly short type of an experience, where 1 minute he's flying through bad weather, the next minute everything changes. And for I couldn't see that sighting have lasted much more than a few minutes as he's flying along, and then it's over. So that's a very interesting time slip from a very credible witness.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, that is. And I've got another really good one to share as well. This is the case of the vanishing hotel. So this is actually quite a famous one, and some listeners may have actually heard of this case. But in 1979, there were two couples who were driving through, English couples, who were driving through France on a holiday, Jeff and Pauline Simpson and Len and Cynthia Gisby. And they were looking for a place to stay near Montélimar. And they found a motel, but they were told that that motel had no vacancies. This is in 1979, and that they should try further down the road. So they set off, and soon they found themselves driving down a cobbled street. And they paused to take an interest in an odd old-fashioned sign for a circus. So they've come down this street, and here's this old sign for a circus that sort of struck there, that they thought that was a bit odd. They kept driving, and soon they came along across a low stone building, which was an inn. And they went inside and were shown to their rooms, and the windows had no glass in them. They were just simple with wood shutters, and the furniture was basic. There was no pillows, no telephones, nothing remotely modern, no lifts. And after eating a meal of steak, eggs, and beer, they retired to bed. And which is,
you can have steak, eggs, and beer in those days.
Exactly, yeah, 1979, And at breakfast in the dining room the next morning, they were struck by some bizarrely dressed individuals. There was a woman in a silk evening gown, came in carrying a dog. And one of the women, Pauline, said it was strange, and it looked like she had just come in from a ball, but it was 7 a.m, and she couldn't take her eyes off her. And two policemen came into the inn as well, into the restaurant area, and they were wearing old-fashioned uniforms, and they were later identified to be French uniforms from about 1905. And they sat down and ate as well. And paying their bill, the couples were astounded that it was 19 francs, which was just over £2, to cover their entire stay. And 2 weeks down the line, on their way home from their holiday, they decided they'd go back and stay at the hotel. And you can see where this is going, can't you? And when they got to that area again, the hotel was no longer there. And they developed the rolls of film they'd snapped, and the cameras the footage was blank. So there was nothing on the negatives that they'd taken. They even returned there 4 years later, trying to find the same inn, and they couldn't find it. What I find so interesting about this particular case is that they were there overnight. That's a really interesting sort of an experience, Yeah. And is it kind of like is a time slip some sort of a ghost experience too, potentially? Like maybe this is some type of, maybe there's a ghost connection to it. I'm not 100% sure, but that was a very, what sort of really struck me about that case was it was the time that they were there for. They were there for a very long time.
Yeah.
There's a couple of strange things about it too. I mean, like if you rocked up to a place with a car, for example, and you're wearing modern clothes and paying with modern money. So they're just questions that I ask. I'm not disputing it, overly, but they're just questions that I have that, how could you see someone from, say it was the early 20th century? It would just seem like there would be a bit of cultural difference there as much as anything that would perhaps make that exchange a bit difficult. But that's a very well documented time slip case, which people who are watching may well be aware of.
And I did forget to mention in the beginning that we are having a guest joining us halfway through this episode who's actually had her own time slip experience, and she's going to come on and tell you about. It's pretty amazing, actually. So, and she has some external corroborating evidence. So I think that's when they get really interesting, isn't it? When you can corroborate these things, to find something to it's not just you talking about something that happened, but someone external to yourself can corroborate it.
Absolutely. That is really a golden thing. It's like an individual's time slip experience. You could say, well, he had some kind of mental episode,
Yeah.
but you've got 3, 4, 2 or more people having the same experience. It's either an actual experience that a group of people is having, or it's a group delusion. I mean, but I don't know that how that works, or even if that's even possible. They talk about these things.
These types of experiences, do you think they happen in particular places on the planet? Because I have heard those ideas. I mean, we've had that come up with crop circles and UFO reports, ghost sightings, etc., where people talk about these things being seen around where ley lines cross, right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether time slips are sort of related to that as well.
That's sort of was a great segue into the next one that I'm going to talk about, which is actually about Liverpool in England, which is a place where there's been multiple time slip encounters. In fact, there's probably been that many of them that a lot of them aren't reported. And I'm only going to talk about 2 of them that are out there and fairly interesting. And the first one's about a young man who was shoplifting in Liverpool back in 2006. Not the greatest thing to be doing. And he ran away from a security guard and headed down Hanover Street in Liverpool. Trying to shake off the guard, he turned into a dead-end street called Brooks Alley. And by this time, he was out of breath and started to get a tight sensation in his chest. And he soon realised that it actually wasn't a problem with him, but was the atmosphere around him. And he waited for the guard to come around the corner after him, but he never appeared. So thinking that he'd given the guard the slip, he sauntered back out and started to walk down Hanover Street again, but he soon realised that something was actually wrong. The road looked different, and so did the pavement. He noticed that cars were driving by that looked very old-fashioned, and the roadworks that he knew were there were now gone. And soon he saw that people around him were wearing strange clothes. And crossing over into Bold Street, Liverpool, he noticed that there were traffic lights where there weren't before, and bushes growing around the Lyceum near a bar that he'd recognised. He carried on walking, and soon he began to feel that something was not quite right. He then began to panic. He realised that somehow he had stepped back in time, and the time slip was not going away. And he remembered that he had his cell phone, and he took it out of his pocket and tried to get a signal. But of course, there was no signal. And he began to really panic. And he soon spotted a kiosk selling newspapers, and he headed over. And leaning over the stand, he looked at the front page of the Daily Post, and there in bold lettering was the date, 18th of May, 1967. And he wondered what to do. Like, what happens if he can't get back to his own time? What about family and friends? So he quickened up his pace and he reached a jeweler's, and he tried his phone again. And this time the phone actually worked. And sighing with relief, he looked around and realised that he had returned to the present. But the strange thing was he could still see down the end of the road people still walking around in 1967.
Mm.
And by the time he'd seen enough and dived onto a bus to go home, when he was interviewed by the local newspaper, he stated 4 times the exact account of what had experienced to him. And so it might be easy to think that he was making the story up to escape from the guard, but the strange tale didn't end there. When the security guard was interviewed, he stated that when he ran after the young man and turned down the alley, that the young man had completely disappeared. And the newspaper checked on the facts of Sean's story, and they found out that everything he said was historically accurate.
Mm. Mm.
So that's a really great time slip experience when you look at this guy who was actually shoplifting. It's been reported and documented in an English newspaper, and perhaps if I have the time, I might try and chase it down.
Yeah.
But bringing that around to the fact that what we're talking about locations, there was another experience in Liverpool as well. This one was a policeman's experience in downtown in the middle of Liverpool, and this was in 1996. This policeman, whose name's Frank, was out shopping and with his wife, and he decided to visit HMV to look for a CD. A CD. And as he walked along near the post office, he suddenly felt as if he had stepped into an oasis of quietness was his description.
Mm.
And he was then shocked to see a small box van reminiscent of the 1950s speed across his path, narrowly missing him and honking its horn. Beep, beep. And he realised he was now standing in the middle of the road and looked at what should have been a bookstore called Dillon's, and the shop now had Crips on the sign. And inside he saw upmarket ladies' handbags and shoes and no books. And he followed a young woman inside and watched in disbelief as the interior snapped back to Dillon's. And the girl was there. He grabbed her by the arm and he asked her if she'd seen the same thing. And she replied, yes, I thought it was a clothes shop. I was going to look around, but it's a bookshop. So that's such a strange thing to happen that, and it's, again, a fairly brief encounter, but a Merseyside policeman is relating this experience that he had in Liverpool.
Fascinating. There was a case that I wanted to talk about too, actually, going back to France. You mentioned the case before that happened in France.
Yeah.
And this one involved two women, Annie Mobley and Frances Jourdain, and they visited Paris in the very early 1900s. And you in the one you read before, you said something about the atmosphere around the person.
Yeah.
And in this case, the two women, they noticed a change in the atmosphere around them too. And then they started to see men in the tri-cornered hats strolling through the grounds of Paris. They saw women in old-fashioned clothing, and they were strolling around. And they said that it actually became apparent that it was around in the 1700s sometimes. That's what they recognised.
Yeah.
And it was only and some of the women that they saw, like, well, there was one in particular that she went to, one of the women, I think it was Frances, she went back to Paris a year later, and she learned that one of the women that she had seen matched Marie Antoinette's description perfectly. On the day that she and her, the day that she and a friend were there, they'd seen a woman, and she didn't know what Marie Antoinette looked like, but at a later trip she found out basically, and said, oh my gosh, that's, one of the women I saw strolling through the streets of Paris was Marie Antoinette. That'd be pretty amazing. I mean, if that happened to me, I'd go, oh my God, like, how does that happen,
Yeah.
Yeah, there was another case, and maybe
just before you move on, they were both highly intelligent women too. They were Oxford dons, and they'd visited on the 10th of August 1901. And this is an interesting point, that on the 10th of August 1792, Versailles had been sacked during the Revolution. So maybe that indicates that maybe in times of stress or significant dates in history, perhaps potentially, maybe that can trigger this sort of thing.
Yeah. But, one of the reasons I became quite interested in time slips was because some people who report close encounters with extraterrestrials, they have these unusual experiences happen too. And one of them was a gentleman who called me, probably about 7 to 10 years ago. I can't quite remember now, but and he was a young man at the time, and he said that he had come home and he was living in his with his mother and stepfather, I think it was, and he didn't really get on well with his stepfather, but he came home and he walked inside the house, and he said every stick of furniture inside the house had been broken into pieces and was piled up in stacks in the room. Now, I don't know whether this is a time slip, but this is certainly a slip of some description. You thought, holy moly, what the heck's happened? What is this about? What am I seeing? Because it didn't make sense. It wasn't logical. All the furniture's broken up and it's stacked up in piles. And then his father-in-law came home. Stepfather came home.
Yeah.
And he didn't get on with his stepfather. He thought, oh my God, he's going to think I've done this, in some sort of fit of rage against his stepfather. So he runs into his room and shuts the door. Anyway, he hears the stepfather come in the door, walks around like he's looking for something, finds it, picks it up and walks out as if nothing's happened. The young man walks out of his bedroom and sees that all the furniture is back in its normal place and state. And he said, I have no idea what that was about. I don't know how I could have seen that. It was like something came in and just wrecked the place, but piled it up neatly, which is very and then it was all reversed. So it's not so much a time slip, but something's happened with time there.
Yes. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point.
Yeah.
That time is manipulated in some way, and it's, almost brings to mind a poltergeist sort of activity, like, poltergeists rearranging a room or, that sort of thing. It's, really big questions.
But that's in that particular case, time had to be reversed, because even with poltergeist activity, you can't put broken furniture back together again.
No, that's right. No, exactly. You cannot put it back together. If it's broken, it's broken.
Absolutely. So time had to be reversed somehow back into its normal state. And it makes me wonder about all these things about like time bubbles that people can step into. And I'm wondering if this is some sort of explanation, no matter how much you understand it or not even know what a time bubble is really, but how people can accidentally or create time bubbles somehow, or they're created externally around them, or, who knows how they happen.
Yeah, that's right. It's really, really interesting. And I've read briefer encounters of, a farmer walking across his paddock, waving to his family and then disappearing, just completely disappearing, what explains, and not falling down a hole or, or some mundane sort of experience. And it also brings to mind the classic Australian book, Picnic at Hanging Rock, which really, is about the mystery of the schoolgirls disappearing. And many people thought that was actually a true story. And if you go to that location, it's got a really, really powerful feeling to it. And I don't know if it's a story that adds to that, but Hanging Rock is definitely a vibrant place that has a lot of. It feels like it's got a lot of ancient power within those rocks. And if you've read the book or seen the film, you go there, you can certainly feel like you could possibly turn around one of the myriad mazes of corners at Hanging Rock and disappear. Yeah.
Actually, it's just reminded me of another case where a woman, she reported seeing a UFO at the back of her property, and it was actually like the classic disc shape, and it was turned on its side, and it was as tall as one of the trees, okay, the diameter of it on its side, one of the large gum trees. But anyway, that's sort of an aside to what we're talking about, because what happened was she then saw her dogs bound out through the paddock behind her, and they disappeared at one point.
Yeah.
They bounded through the paddock and they reappeared at another point.
Wow.
So again, this could be some sort of a time bubble. Or it's time distortion. It could be a distortion of reality in a way that we don't understand, because it has to be some sort of distortion of, or we just don't understand physics properly, which we don't. We're always still in the learning process of our own physics, aren't we?
We are, yes, it is. And it's just it's eternally evolving, and hopefully down the track we'll have some answers to some of these questions. And there's stories of people who, especially in England, for example, who are out walking and they encounter Roman legions, or from any period of British history. On a British lane, you can bump into someone from the past. So the question being, did you travel back to their time, or did they travel into your time?
Yes.
Yes. So
it's a question, isn't it?
It's a very, very, very big question.
In the 90s, I had a series of reports of people talking about, and this is when UFO activity was high, and I know we're not going down that track, but it's about the people who have these types of experiences. who seem to be predisposed to anomalous experiences, right?
Yeah.
And they were, I mean, I had many people tell me that they would see people dressed in clothing out of our time, where they would seem to appear out of nowhere and walk across the street in front of them and then disappear, like some of these cases that we're talking about. Or they'd see cars of the 1920s era, which like the long black, really old-fashioned sedan styles, right? That you think, where did that come from? And the car, and it'd come out, and they it'd be, I know one case where it was behind them. They're looking at it like this and looking at it, and they watching what they're doing and keeping an eye on it, and then they look again and it's gone. Another few cases where it would come out of a side street, go across in front of them, and as they drove up to see where it had gone down the street, being quite amazed at what they were seeing, it had disappeared. Those sorts of things, very strange.
It's unbelievable. It is, yeah. There's, stories, and I mean, you can drive down the road and see an old car with with club plates on it driving around on a Sunday, on any given Sunday. But people do encounter cars that don't appear to be like that, and they've got old registration plates, and the people are dressed in the clothing of the time, and the car doesn't look like it's been, like some sort of club car. It's it's in the condition of what it would have been from the time period that it came from, whether it's the 1940s or the 1950s. And it's interesting that time slips can be either like not that far back in time, or you can be thrown back to Roman times, or, so to go back to 1967, like the example of the young man who was shoplifting, you could go, well, that's not that far ago. That's 53 years ago, or even ending up in 1975, So.
One of the things I find interesting with some of these cases too is, like, I remember one in particular was someone was out bushwalking, and it was a very hot summer's day in Australia. But the scene that they saw open up before them was cold. It was, these people were dressed in very long, almost down to the ground fur coats. They had the hats on that they had in Russia. And it was a very old-fashioned, long black streamlined sedan from about the 1920s. I don't even know if they had them then, but they said it was about 1920s, 90s, 30s, looked around that sort of era. And the people were standing there, and the scene itself was cold, there was snow on the ground, and a bit of wind and all that sort of stuff. And so it was very different to the Australian temperature. So I think that's really interesting too.
It's great. I mean, is time sort of like, is it spinning around? Is it kind of like, can it sort of like do a rewind in an instant, and you in the mass that we are transported back to that period of time, presumably relevant to that geographical area. So you're not going to end up in 15th century China if you're walking down the streets of Liverpool, for example, but what's to say that might not happen too?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Ben, we've got Gem waiting to come in, and Gem's going to talk to us about her particular time slip experience, which is pretty amazing, I think. So I'll just bring Gem in, and there she is. Hi, Gem.
Hello, how are you?
G'day.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us for this episode about time slip. I'm really interested to hear about your experience. So tell us all about it.
Time slip you're talking about, obviously. Well, I've had quite a few time slips which have been really short ones, where you're walking along a street and then you look around and things suddenly look different. So you've got like different buildings or whatever, differently dressed people, but it literally lasts maybe 1 or 2 seconds. The best time slip experience I had must have lasted between 20 and 30 minutes, but to me it felt like a couple of minutes only. And it was up in Hawaii, up at Waimea Bay, right on the far north of Oahu. So I was there. It was 2004, and I went and I was just wandering around the beach. It's the most famous place for surfers, and I found this little stall with a surfer dude who was selling different trinkets and things, and I was chatting to him, and he said that they'd just taken down one of these sort of temple things recently, and he was selling some of the things, and that was this. So I bought this, and I use it all the time as a trigger object when I do lots of the ghost work and stuff. So it looks like a bird man. It's the bird man. So anyway, I bought that, and anyway, I was talking to him about the supernatural and how I was interested, and he said, right, you need to go up to the Hayao, up on the very top of the hill. And I was like, oh, okay. Didn't know what it was. He says, oh, it's a temple. Didn't tell me anything about it. So off I drove up there. It was probably 4:35, something like that. But it wasn't dusk yet. It was just normal. Went up there with my partner at the time, and saw that it was just like a big pile of rocks. It's actually a massive place. It's over 2 acres, the place, but it's made, it's about this high with rocks, so about this high all the way around, and there was just a tiny little plaque, and it's called Pu'uo Mahuka Hayao. That's all it says. Historic site. It was 1962 that it was actually made into a proper place and stuff and protected, but I knew nothing else, and I wandered around it, and then I thought, well, it doesn't say anything about you can't walk in it or anything, because I was literally stepping over stones. I wasn't doing, I wasn't damaging the stones themselves or anything. Stepped over, instantly everything changed. It was black dark, and there was a massive roaring fire in there. The walls were half of it, the walls were of this stone, like literally just piled up little stones, little volcanic stones. And then above that, it was like sort of raffia type stuff. There was like a raffia roof with a big hole in the middle and this massive fire in the middle. And it was full of men, full of these men. And they were all dressed. They had like sort of like a little grass skirt, but it wasn't hiding anything, but just a little bit. And these big sort of plumes, some had like leaves, and some had sort of feathers, and the usual sort of stuff they'd expect. Real Indiana Jones stuff. They had black markings all over there and all over their chest, and were naked totally. They were really sweaty, and it was really hot, and they were chanting, and there was drums going on. And I was just standing there sort of thinking, what is this, first of all. And then I realized it must be some sort of a time slip, or maybe I'm just, witnessing some sort of replay, something like that. And I was watching it, and so I started looking around, and then thought, oh, I wonder if they can see me. But people were literally passing through me. They were chanting and dancing around this fire, and then there was a group of them around this big massive rock. It was a massive rock, flat rock, and there was a person that they were pushing down onto it who was going to be sacrificed, and there was blood all around the floor, and it stunk of blood, like a butcher's shop type thing, and it was really hot and stinky, smelled of dirty man, and sweaty, yucky. It was a horrible, so it was all these different sensations. So it wasn't just visual, it wasn't just audible. I could smell it, I could feel the heat, so I'm having all these different sensations at the same time. And they were pushing this man down and holding him backwards like this, so that the whole of the chest was exposed, and he was bent sort of this way over the rock, like bent round on the rock. And some had these massive machetes, and some had some sort of like spear type things, and they were all chanting the same thing. There was a kahuna, a priest standing at the very top. Well, there were 3 of them, but there was one main person who I assume was the main kahuna, and they were shouting, Hali Mohimba, Hali Mohimba, Hali Mohimba, Naha Nahu. And I was like, whoa. And it just was going on, and the drums were going doom, 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 doom. And it was absolutely amazing, but also terrifying. So it was a combination of the two. And I was just so shocked. And they pushed, as I say, they pushed this man down, and I was looking around, and it was just going on. And I just thought, wow, if they kill him, I really don't want to witness this. Because they were about to kill him, and I really didn't want to witness it. So I thought, right, just like you do in lucid dreaming, I thought, right, I need to get out of this. So I turned and I stepped straight out, because I'd literally just done one step into the place, and I stepped straight out, and suddenly everything was different again. It was nearly dusk. It was just going dusk. And this place is right on the promontory. It is literally, you can see the whole of the bay below. It's literally on the end. I was just amazed. And I looked down, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what happened? I was shaking. I was so surprised at what had happened. And I bent down, and there was this little rock just on the outside. It wasn't as part of the rocks, but it was on the outside. And it was about that big, and I haven't found it. I've been looking for it. It's about that big, and it was in the shape of a skull. It was definitely a skull, a bit like the skull here with the big open eyes. This obviously used to have pearl or something in, but it was like that. So I picked it up. Probably shouldn't have, but I did. I took it. And I ran over to my partner, and I was like, oh, did you see anything? Did you see what happened? And they're like, no, because they'd gone back to the car and were having food and, just totally not interested. And I was like, well, this amazing thing happened. And they're just like, oh, yeah. But anyway, since then, I had this chant going on and on. I got to the airport, and I was looking, when we got to the airport, because we're flying around the world onto Vancouver, I was looking in the thing for a little dictionary. I had a look in the dictionary to see if I could find any of the words. One of them was like death, and I was thinking, oh, that means it must be real. It must be real. But as soon as I got back home, I wrote straight to the Hawaiian University, to the Department of Linguistics, and said, this is what I've got. This is what it is. I've written it phonetically. And they said, oh, we don't recognize necessarily how you've written it, but could you say it? So I did a little tape, and I sent it over to them, a recording. Anyway, I did that, and they were saying, well, it's more of an older language. It's more of an ancient language than now. It's an archaic language, but it is Hawaiian. And they said, yes, it's probably about Ku, who is the god of war. He's the big kahuna, the one of all of them. There's him, and there's Hainau, who is the woman equivalent, the female equivalent, and he is worshipped usually from dawn. He's associated with dawn and east, and he is the god of war, and he's the one that you sacrifice to. Now I found a little leaflet which is all about it now, which they didn't have at the time, which is all about the actual place, and it says that it was probably from 1600. And it's in the 18th century. In 1770, there was a high priest, or Pulu, who was under the chief Kahanahana, who oversaw this heiau, and that he actually was the one that started making it into a sacrificial temple. Before that, it was used as a place of communication. So it was a portal that they used to talk to the gods and everything, and it was a nice place. It was a spiritual portal. And so all this stuff was confirmed, because a couple of years ago I did a show on Hawaiian gods and things like that, and I found somebody who actually does lots of tours around that area, and he works in the paranormal, and he's obviously Hawaiian as well, and he is Lopaka Kapanui, and he is really interesting. So I sent him a message, and I said, look, this is what happened to me. Please, I'm writing it phonetically. Can you tell me what it means? What happens with it? So I'm going to read you what he says, because I think it's funny. So he says that as a matter of course, we're in Hawaii, natives and locals alike know that it's common practice not to enter any kind of heiau, no matter what the previous use of the edifice may have been. This comes as a result of the Queen Hamanumu, who overthrew the male-dominated kapu system. So this is around that sort of time. And after the passing of her husband, they burned all the wooden idols and toppled all the walls of all the heiau around, but it was never reconsecrated or anything done with it. So basically, it was just left. And when I was up there, there was a whole big table for the offerings, and they had like all food and fruit and things like that was all there for them. So people were still worshipping there and leaving things. And so he said, as a result of this action, Hawaiian natives and locals know well enough not to tread within the walls of such revered places. He says, I must say, Dr. Regan, that you took quite a chance in venturing within the confines of Pu'u o Mahuka Heiau, for its original use was harnessing a kind of electromagnetic field in a spiritual vortex, so that our ancient priests could use this energy for telepathic communication. Now, this is, I read this in a book, in another book somewhere else, so he's further confirming that. That Heiau, having been then rededicated, was used for human sacrifice and served to contaminate that pure energy. So today it is a repository for all of the history, psychic thumbprints, and traumatic impressions that are left by the foolish human beings who used it. He said, you indeed did experience a time slip, because I've seen it myself while standing on the outside of the walls. And I've also heard voices which were fortunately recorded on a digital recorder. I'll study the chant and I'll give it my best translation. So he came back to me with the chant, and he says it meant, Harley is a house of, so everything's a Harley is a house of, so temple of, a house, so a dwelling, a place. So it was the house of mourning or death is Mahina. And so it was Harley Mahina, and then it was Nahana, and Nahana's to do the work of, Ku, which is the god of war. So basically everything is translated literally, and it means exactly that. Now, I've never been to Hawaii before. I'd never read anything about Hawaii in particular. I had a fascination with Easter Island, of course, but never with Hawaii. And so I'd only been there staying at Waikiki Beach one day. So I hadn't done anything. I hadn't absorbed anything. So I just found it really fascinating that if I was that good at to make it all up, then it was correct. It was phonetically correct. It had meaning. So, and all this has been proven, you know, I have all this historical data to show that it was done. So it was probably around a few hundred years ago, between 1770, probably 1800, that I was there, that I actually visited back and witnessed what they were doing, just literally by stepping across that threshold. I find fascinating, you know, I mean, it's great. It's all very well to have experiences. But if you can, as being a scientist, if you can scientifically verify anything about it, even the fact that it was a heiau and that it was used for sacrifices and those sorts of things, but then to have this chant that I had in my head and still do, I still recall it at least once a week, which is really weird. Just, I don't know, it's quite incredible to me.
Yeah, that's amazing, Gem. But I wanted to ask you, I know you're a paranormal investigator and a scientist. How do both those aspects of your understanding, how do they blend together in this experience?
Well, as I say, the minute that I got to the car, I wrote down the chant in case I didn't remember it. I wrote it phonetically because I thought maybe it means something. And I wrote down my experience totally, because I haven't got a great memory for things. So straight away, I was trying to find verification of what happened. I'd also looked at the time, so I knew that it was about, as I say, between 20 and 30 minutes that I actually been gone, just standing there, and I hadn't done anything. You know, I literally just stepped in there. And as I say, the sun was going down at that time, which I find interesting, because if it was Ku, you would expect it to have been the morning for the dawn. So it must have happened. I must have actually not been there in real time in the evening, but in the morning I must have visited, because it was dark. So obviously the sun hadn't risen yet when I had the experience. So yes, as a scientist, I mean, I have millions of different experiences all the time. I think I've probably experienced nearly every kind of paranormal thing that you can experience. So I always try and verify it in some way. Make some sort of recording so that there's when it's shared experiences, it's even better. But I did ask if they would jump in with me, the person I was with, but they said no, to go back in with it and see if anything happened to them, but they refused. So.
So when you stepped over that threshold, it was an instant transportation back to to that time period.
No going through a wormhole or doing anything.
No.
I just sat there, and it was dark, it was hot, it was smelly, it was noisy. Everything was there within the second, like literally there. Wasn't like I looked around and thought, oh yeah, and then something happened. It was amazing. It was just crossing that into that vortex, as he said. It was this vortex, and since then I've bought loads of books on Hawaiian magic and those sorts of things, and that's where I've got a lot of the information from about this, about how amazing it is. And I didn't even know really about coup or anything then. I was quite ignorant about it all. So.
And were the men like real men, or they weren't like translucent or passing through you or anything like that? It was like
it was everything was solid. Every experience I have with ghosts, they've always been solid. They've always looked solid. They've always looked real. They've never looked ethereal or ghost-like as we imagine them to be. They've always just been just there. And as I say, they were actually walking through me, so I was literally just like a fly on the wall watching a replay rather than projected replay rather than being physically there.
So they weren't reacting to you in any way.
No, there was no. As I said, they were walking through me. I still got scared and thought, what happens if they do see me? Because I'm going to be the next one on there, and then how would that be explained? Because they were doing lots of sacrifices. It wasn't just one. As I said, there was blood everywhere, so they'd obviously already sacrificed somebody, at least one person, and this bloke was going to be the next. And I really didn't want to witness that. I thought it was. I'm really interested, but I really didn't. I just had it was a really bad feeling there as well. Even just coming up the hill. And remember, I knew nothing. I'm thinking it's a temple, been to all the temples in New Zealand. I'd just come from New Zealand and gone to all those temples there. And so I was expecting it to be somewhere fabulous, somewhere nice and light and loving, and which is what it was originally for. But as I say, from about 1770, 1780, that's what they said. Then they started doing the ritual sacrifices to Ku, because it was a time of famine. And great stress. And there's another heiau just on Kauai Island, and they lit fires between the two places for communication. You could actually see where it is. So they would have that so they obviously did simultaneous rituals as well in the two places.
It'd be interesting to see if you went back there, if that experience would happen again, or if that was simply you were there on the right day. That's an interesting thing. Would you go back there?
Definitely. I would do it again. I mean, I probably shouldn't, because, as I say, I didn't know that I was disrespecting anything, because being in England, you've got ruins everywhere. You can walk around the Roman ruins always. There's nobody ever says anything. If they want you not to touch anything, then they fence it off. So I assumed it was the same. Obviously, I didn't touch the walls themselves. But yeah, it's really interesting. I loved it. I thought it was great.
I have a question for you, Gem. When you came out of that, when you stepped back out of that space, did you have knowledge of what you were physically doing in that 30 minutes? Like, were you just standing there?
Yeah, I was literally standing observing, and it felt like it had only been 2 minutes at the most, because as I said, I was watching what they were doing, and it must have only been 2 minutes. So time obviously changed, because I would say in their time it was 2 minutes that I was there, maybe 3 at the very most.
But in your time it was 30 minutes?
It was between 25 and 30 minutes that I'd been missing. So I'd been standing there. And there was nobody else around. As I say, this place, that some things had been left, but nobody goes there. And I'd talked to, when I went back to the hotels and stuff, I asked loads of people about it, and they were like, "Oh no, I wouldn't go to one of those places. No." They wouldn't even go there, let alone. But I did feel it as we drove up. I thought, oh, it feels, ominous. I often feel those feelings.
Did you feel like in the environment that you could actually move around in that environment, or you just?
Yeah, well, I did. I was turning around. I was looking around.
Yeah, so you were moving around in that. Yeah, right.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, I didn't move too far, because I knew the wall was behind me where I'd entered. But I was turning around. I saw the altar. I saw the fire. I saw behind me. There was people all around. There were even benches, like sort of sort of stone. I think there were benches on the sides, and there were people sitting as well, as if they were observing, but they were all wearing the same same garb. They were all naked, basically, and sweaty, and they would obviously use black ash. It looked like black ash that they'd use for markings on themselves, black right around their faces, a lot of them, and the priest and the other two people had black all over their faces and just the whites of their eyes showing, which was pretty spooky as well. So, so I could tell, and they had better garbs and stuff, better outfits and headdresses. So I could tell that they were the kahunas, the big kahunas.
Yeah, and no doubting the ranking.
I just find that fascinating, actually, that you've had that corroboration, like someone actually recognized the chant. That just blows my mind, actually.
Yeah, that's an incredible.
Yeah.
And as I say, two places, the Hawaiian place, they said, we'd probably need to get some specialists. It's probably something, because that's the thing, lots of magical and ritualistic language is very different to everyday language. And so they were using a more sort of archaic form, but it's I mean, you can just look it up on the dictionary online, and it comes up with the same things. So, and I was just doing it phonetically. But yes, it's fascinating.
Amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that experience. That's I'm sure viewers will find that as fascinating as we did. That's been great. Thanks for joining us, Gem. And
no worries.
Just for people who might like to, Gem actually has a radio show on Saturday nights.
Sunday nights.
Sorry?
Sunday nights.
Nights, that's right. It's changed. Yeah, called The Witching Hour. And what's the time? What time?
10 p.m. till midnight on 4ZZZ, 102.1 FM, or you can just stream it on 4ZZZ.org.au.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to hear more of what Gem talks about on her radio show.
All paranormal, conspiracy, all the usual weird stuff.
A little bit based on your own experiences, right?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, that's what's so handy about it, is that I have so many experiences. I can trot one out and then see what other people think.
Yeah.
And see what that other, because there's obviously a lot of differences between people. But yeah, I use this my little man here, and I think maybe this could have been a trigger, having this with me, because I did actually take it into the thing with me. I know it's a different time. I think this is probably only about 100 years old at the most, wherever it is. But I just think maybe that helped. Who knows?
Yeah, amazing.
They weren't wearing that mask or anything.
Oh, well, thanks, Gem, for joining us. We'll have to have you back and talk about some more of
Absolutely, yeah. Fascinating.
Because I've heard a lot of them, so I know that they're pretty out there.
Whenever I tell you one, you always say, "Oh, I don't remember that one." I say, "Well, I told you that one." Remember, I was called Australia's most haunted woman in one of those magazines.
I know. There's so many of them I just don't remember because it's just a lot.
Well, I'm the same, you see. People keep reminding me of things that have happened, and that's why I have to try and write them down as much as possible.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks, Gem. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And thanks, Cheryl.
Oh, well, there you go, Ben. That was pretty incredible, wasn't it?
Yeah, that kind of blew me away, really. Like, it was pretty happy with the historical cases that I've found, which are all very interesting in themselves. But that's a very intense time slip experience, isn't it? To instantly step through a threshold and have be transplanted into it, in high definition is incredible, and perhaps it was perhaps Jem was meant to see that man be sacrificed. I don't know. That was my thought, that may have been the case, that could have been a reason why it happened. But
yeah, pretty phenomenal, and I could understand why she would have been quite shocked and frightened.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You would not expect something like that to occur. It's just I'd love to see it myself.
You want to see everything yourself.
I do. I want to see, I want to experience, I want to be part of it all.
Anyway, that's it from us, folks, for another episode. And we will be back in another fortnight to talk about, we're not sure yet what, but we will let you know. And for another episode of Strange Encounters Down Under. So until then, take care.
We look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah.